All right, so now that we've got some items entered into the database, let's go ahead and create a view so that we can see these items. So let's go back into our menu app, views.py. We want to import item from models, from .models, import item. And let's go ahead and create a view to list out these items. So def item list, and it takes in the request. And we can just return an HTTP response like so, HTTP response. And we can just pass in hello world as a test. So we're getting this error because we need to import this. So up here next to render from Django shortcuts, let's import HTTP response like so. Go ahead and save that. Now that we have our view created, let's go ahead and hook up a URL so that it knows when to run this view. So in our menu app, let's add a new file, urls.py. Before we do anything, let's go ahead and include this URL file in our project urls.py file. So under config urls.py, let's also import from django.urls include. And then we can add another path here, and this will just be an empty route. And we can include, and we can pass in menu.urls. Again, we want that trailing comma. We can save that and close out this config urls.py file and head back into our menu app urls.py. And from django.urls import path, so we can set up some paths. And then from .views, we want to import that view. So import item list. And now let's set up our URL patterns. If I can spell URL patterns, and it's going to be this list of paths. So the first path, we'll just make it as an empty route, and it will be item list, like so. So we can save that. Make sure your server is running. So mine is running, and let's open this up in a web browser to see what it looks like. And awesome, if we go to localhost 8000, boom, we get hello world. So it's hooked up and configured correctly. Now let's update this view to actually return the data, some of those items. So we can minimize the terminal and go back into our view. And right now we're just returning an HTTP response, but let's see if we can return some of these items. So first thing we're going to want to do is grab the items. So items equals item.objects.all. And now what if we just passed items into this HTTP response? So let's go ahead and save that and go back into our browser and see what this looks like. So if we go back to localhost 8000, we can see we see something. We see our items. But this is actually just the dunder string return method, the string representation of those items. So it's the name of the item, pipe sign, the price, and then there's no space or anything. It's just these items. And while this displays something related to the items, it's hard to work with. It's just a string. There's nothing really separating these items. Let's see if we can return this in that JSON response that we talked about. So lucky for us, Django has a response built in, JSON response, that we can import. So from django.http import JSON response. And if we look at the help text, it's an HTTP response that consumes data and serializes it as JSON. So maybe we can just use JSON response instead of the HTTP response and pass it items. So now let's go ahead and save this. Make sure your server is still running and go back into the web browser and reload the page. And if we reload the page, we see we get this error. In order to allow non-dict objects to be serialized, set the safe parameter to false. Okay, so let's try that. So let's try and go back and in our JSON response, set safe equals false, like so, and reload the web page again. And we get another error. We get object of type query set is not JSON serializable. So what this means is that when we actually query the database with the Django ORM, when we do item.objects.all, what we get returned is a query set object. And it's saying that that is not JSON serializable. Now, we did mention that JSON objects are very close to Python dictionaries. So what if we just tried to transform this query set into a Python dictionary? Let's go back into the code and try that out. So let's take this items query set that we have right here and transform it into a Python object, a Python list or a Python dictionary. So in this case, we can do a list of objects. So it can be a list of Python dictionaries, like so. So what we can do is create an empty list first. Item list equals an empty list. And then we can loop through each item in the items object and append it to item list. So item list.append. And what we can append is a Python dictionary. And so a Python dictionary just has a key value pair. So we could say the first item is the name, and this will be item.name. We can Shift-Alt down arrow to duplicate this and create another item for price. But we do want to update this value to not be a string. We just want it to be the actual variable that's coming from the database. So it'll reference item right here and be the name. Then we want price to be item.price. And let's duplicate this one more time and make this the description. And we could say item.description. So now what we have is item list. That's a list of Python dictionaries for each menu item. So let's see if instead of passing items, we can pass item list, but we can make this a Python dictionary too. And so have the value be item list and have the key be menu items. Like so. So now we have a Python dictionary that we're passing this with the key of menu items, and the value is item list, which is this list of items, each of which are their own Python dictionary. If we go ahead and save this and make sure your server is running and go back to the web browser, and if we reload the page, now we don't see an error, we actually see this information. So we actually see the data in what looks like a Python dictionary, and then there's that list here, menu items, and then each item from our database, each menu item is another Python dictionary. And so you may see something like this where it's raw. I have an extension called JSON formatter that lets me display the JSON data like this, a little bit more visually appealing, but you can see here that this is a dictionary with the key menu items, and then the value is this list of items. Awesome. So now this is actually data that could be plugged into any client, into any kind of application, and consumed. But if we look back at the code, we kind of had to do a lot to get from querying the database to returning this data, right? We had to go through the whole list of items that we got back from the database and then turn them all into a Python dictionary. So in the next video, we're going to take a look at Django REST framework and how it can make this much quicker and has a lot of this functionality built right in.